This is a Reconstructionist radio production. Is the World Running Down? Crisis in the Christian Worldview by Gary North. Copyright 1988. Published by Institute for Christian Economics. Narrated by Tegan Moore. This book is dedicated to Arthur Robinson, who pushed me into an intellectual corner, thereby decreasing my intellectual entropy. Preface. But if there be no resurrection of the dead, then is Christ not risen. And if Christ be not risen, then is our preaching vain, and your faith is also vain. Yea, and we are found false witnesses of God, because we have testified of God that he raised up Christ, whom he raised not up, if so be that the dead rise not. For if the dead rise not, then is not Christ raised, and if Christ be not raised, your faith is vain. Ye are yet in your sins. 1 Corinthians 15:13-17. This book asks, and then attempts to answer one question. Which is more important, Adam's fall or the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ? It seems like such a simple question for a Christian to answer. The answer seems so easy. Obviously, the resurrection is more important, now and in eternity. If there had been no resurrection of Christ, our faith would be vain. But this answer immediately raises a second question. Which is more important, the effects of Christ's resurrection in history, or the effects of Adam's fall, God's curse of the ground, in history? My answer to this corollary question is going to make a lot of very dedicated Christians unhappy. I answer that the effects of Christ's resurrection are more important as time goes by than the effects of Adam's fall. The implications of this statement, if believed and put into daily practice, would revolutionize the Christian world. In fact, they would revolutionize the entire fallen world. I will go further. The implications will revolutionize the fallen world. Yet, this is what most Christians categorically deny today. They deny it because they have been taught, implicitly and explicitly, that the effects of Adam's fall are overwhelmingly, inevitably more powerful in history than Christ's resurrection. This book is my answer to this denial. Scientific methodology and eschatology. I wish this book were not necessary. It will alienate some very dedicated Christians who have devoted their careers to refuting the fundamental world and life view of our age. Darwinian evolution. What I present in this book is a Bible-based case against the prevailing apologetic approach of most scientifically trained six-day creationists. Their arguments have yet to convince more than a few sporadic evolutionists, and not one of the prominent ones. But more important, this methodology has simultaneously weakened the case for biblical Christianity, for they have relied on a weak reed, an appeal to the second law of thermodynamics, sometimes referred to in textbooks as the law of entropy. This is a book on theology, meaning applied theology or practical theology. Before we begin, we must ask ourselves, what are the fundamental doctrines of Christianity? They are these: God, the Trinity, God's creation of the universe out of nothing by the power of his spoken word in 6 consecutive and contiguous 24-hour days, God's creation of man as his image, God's covenant with man to exercise dominion over the earth as his lawful covenantal representative, the temptation of Adam by Satan, the ethical fall of Adam, God's subsequent cursing of both man and the earth, God's judgment of the earth by a universal flood, the preservation of mankind and land animals by means of an ark, God's scattering of rebellious mankind at the Tower of Babel through the confusion of language, God's covenantal adoption of Israel as a nation in history, God's giving to Israel his law for the establishment of a covenant law order, the incarnation of Jesus Christ, born of a virgin, the death, bodily resurrection, and bodily ascension of Christ, the establishment of Christ's kingdom in heaven, definitively, and on earth, progressively, Christ's issuing of the quote-unquote Great Commission of world discipleship, the sending of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, the second coming of Christ, the resurrection of all people at the final judgment, God's casting of Satan and his followers, including resurrected human covenant breakers, into the eternal lake of fire, and the entrance of resurrected covenant keepers into the sin-free, eternal new heavens and new earth. Remove any one of these doctrines and you emasculate Christianity. Christians have long debated about the chronological order of the events after Pentecost, but to deny any of these doctrines is to abandon God's Bible-revealed plan for the ages. Scientific creationism has openly emphasized 4 of these doctrines: the 6-day creation out of nothing, God's curse of the ground, the universal Noahic flood, and Christ's second coming. It has not dealt systematically with Christ's bodily resurrection. This neglect of the doctrine of Christ's resurrection has seriously crippled the scientific creation movement. Without Christ's bodily resurrection, no event that followed the crucifixion would make sense, at least until the final judgment. Without his resurrection, there would be no need for God to postpone the final judgment, except to increase the number of people to be condemned to eternal torment. Without Christ's resurrection, Paul says, Christians' faith is vain, 1 Corinthians 15:14-17. Yet it is this doctrine, the touchstone of Christianity, and the primary offense to the fallen world, that scientific creationism relegates to secondary or less importance, preferring instead to emphasize the scientific importance of God's curse of the ground after Adam's rebellion, which they equate with the second law of thermodynamics. Until scientific creationists self-consciously begin to re-examine their worldview in terms of the doctrine of Christ's resurrection, its members will be hampered in their efforts to persuade Christians and non-Christians concerning the importance of the doctrine of the 6-day creation. A doctrine of creation without a doctrine of the resurrection is as erroneous as a doctrine of the resurrection without a doctrine of creation. The first position, the 6-day creation without Christ's resurrection, leads to Pharisaism, and the second position, Christ's resurrection without the 6-day creation, leads step by step to neo-evangelicalism, Barthianism, and neo-orthodoxy. Ignoring the Church's foundation of victory. There is no doubt in my mind that the scientific creation movement has been vital in challenging the major religion of the modern age, Darwinism. Scientific creationists have been correct in pointing to the Bible's account of the Noahic flood as the key event in the geological historical record of the earth. They have given Bible-believing Christians much-needed confidence in challenging the number one secular humanist myth of our day. Certainly, my own thought has been shaped by scientific creationism's conclusions regarding the inapplicability of Darwin's hypothesis to the Earth's geological record. I read and generally accepted the Genesis flood in 1963. I even used the libraries of Christian Heritage College and the Creation Research Society to gather information that I used in writing this book. But I have abandoned the most shaky pillar of their defense, their misuse of the entropy doctrine. That pillar has always rested on a foundation of humanist sand. Strengthening the case. What I want to do in this book is strengthen the case for 6-day creationism. I have become convinced that the scientific creationists have been much too soft and academically gracious in their dealings with God-hating Darwinian scientists. These defenders of the faith have not, quote, gone for the jugular, end quote, of their opponents, for they have accepted too many of their opponents' illegitimate ground rules in the debate. Scientific creationists have offered their intellectual opponents far too much ammunition. Scientific creationists have allowed the Darwinists to establish the methodological starting point in the debate over the origins of the universe and man, the autonomous mind of man. The problem with this strategy is that if you acknowledge the legitimacy of your opponent's presupposition about man's autonomy, the best you can hope to achieve is to convince him that his starting point does not lead to the conclusions he has proclaimed. But you cannot rationally go from his erroneous presupposition to a correct conclusion. A person's starting point determines his conclusions. You cannot show him what is correct. You can only show him that what he has concluded cannot be true. You can at best demonstrate to him or the audience that he doesn't have a leg to stand on. But our goal should be to provide him with a pair of working legs, not simply to expose his artificial legs in public debate. This insight regarding the proper starting point in all debate has been argued forcefully by Cornelius Van Til, and the unwillingness of the creation science movement to understand his point and adopt his apologetic method has crippled their efforts as surely as their debate points have crippled their Darwinist opponents. The problem is, the Darwinists are perfectly willing to continue to hobble along on their artificial legs, pretending that they are Olympic sprinters, rather than to go to the Bible for their source of scientific knowledge. Once you accept the premise of the autonomy of man's mind to sit in judgment on the truths God has revealed, you are forever condemned to hobble on artificial legs, legs that are themselves the gift of God in His common grace. As a result, scientific creationists are limiting themselves to hobbling when they could sprint. They use only humanism's artificial legs for the quote-unquote sake of argument. Van Til writes, quote, "A deductive argument as such leads only from one spot in the universe to another spot in the universe. So also an inductive argument as such can never lead beyond the universe. In either case, there is no more than an infinite regression. In both cases, it is possible for the smart little girl to ask, if God made the universe, who made God? And no answer is forthcoming. This answer is, for instance, a favorite reply of the atheist debater Clarence Darrow. But if it be said to such opponents of Christianity that unless there were an absolute God, their own questions and doubts would have no meaning at all, there is no argument in return. There lies the issue. It is the firm conviction of every epistemologically self-conscious Christian that no human being can utter a single syllable, whether in negation or affirmation, unless it were for God's existence." End quote. Half a dozen of the most forensically skilled of the scientific creationists have been tactically successful in many brief public debates with Darwinists, but only because of the weak scientific case for Darwinism and the weak debaters who have foolishly agreed to show up. They have been public amputation sessions, not conversion sessions. These one-night successes have strengthened the self-confidence of Bible-believing Christians, and they have recruited a few science students and even fewer faculty members. Nevertheless, scientific creationists and their associates have not yet begun to offer a systematic, comprehensive alternative worldview to the dominant Darwinian paradigm. They have failed to recognize clearly that the heart of Darwinism's hold on the thinking of the modern world is not the evolutionists' scientific case, which has been remarkably weak from the beginning, but rather the very worldview of Darwinism, for it conforms to the primary long-term goal of autonomous man, to escape from God's judgments, historical and final. By narrowing the focus of their chosen intellectual battleground, scientific creationists have not yet successfully attacked the soft underbelly of Darwinism, historical despair. Scientific creationists, by proclaiming the sovereignty of the entropy process, have also immersed their own worldview in historical despair. They can offer Darwinists and their followers only an escape from history, Jesus' second coming. Historical escape is exactly what New Age mystics offer them, but without asking them to give up the fundamental principle of their Darwinian religion, an escape from God's judgments. Which, if either, of these escapist religious appeals should we expect to win the hearts of Darwinian humanists, New Age mysticism or scientific creationism? The answer is obvious. The New Age mystics allow secular humanists to retain the heart of their Darwinian religion, human autonomy. An alternative to historical despair. Christians need a better alternative than historical despair, both for themselves and for their presentation of Christ's gospel of redemption. We are at war with post-Darwinian evolutionism, and this war encompasses every area of life. Very few Christians recognize the comprehensive, literally life and death nature of this war, including members of the scientific creation movement. Marx understood it, Lenin understood it, but Christians don't. Occasional tactical victories during well-organized evening debates are motivationally encouraging to those Christians who happen to attend or listen to the tapes, but these tactical victories are not decisive to the outcome of the war. The Darwinists are still winning the visible war. Not a single liberal arts college or university has been captured for six-day creationism. Christian Heritage College began with six-day creationism. It was not captured for it. There has not even been a close call. Not a single Christian denomination or association has adopted the doctrine of the six-day creation as a screening doctrine for the ordination of its pastors and deacons, let alone the faculty members at their underfunded, struggling colleges. This indicates that the vast majority of Christians still do not believe that the doctrine of the six-day creation is relevant for Christian spiritual life. There is a reason for this. Scientific creationists have written virtually nothing on how and why the doctrine of the six-day creation must reshape all of modern Christian theology and the entire Christian way of life. Christians have not been shown clearly and decisively that Darwinism is a total worldview, and that by accepting any aspect of this worldview, Christians compromise and weaken the presentation of the Christian worldview, as well as risk disobeying God. They have not been shown how evolutionism spreads like cancer from the geology or biology textbook to every area of personal ethics and public policy. Worse, they have not been shown why and how six-day creationism leads to a fundamentally unique worldview that encompasses things other than academic topics like historical geology and biology. To win the battle with Darwinism, which is above all a comprehensive worldview, justifying comprehensive power, six-day creationists must believe that the stakes are far larger than mere laboratory experiments or one-evening debates. Creation scientists must demonstrate to Christians that six-day creationism really makes a difference in every area of life. Only a handful of Christians are ever willing to sacrifice their reputations and present associations for the sake of some rarefied theological doctrine. The scientific creation movement has not yet persuaded Christians that its doctrinal position is anything more than a rarefied theological opinion developed by ivory tower specialists in the natural sciences. The only people who seem to understand how much of a threat the six-day creation doctrine is to all of modern secular humanism are the best-informed secular humanists on one side and the Christian Reconstructionists on the other. The secular humanists reject the conclusions of the scientific creationists and argue that the creationists' official methodology, the appeal to scientific neutrality, is a charade, while the Christian Reconstructionists accept the creationists' conclusions but reject their methodology as self-deception rather than a charade. Saul's armor. The scientific creationists' case against Darwinism has been narrowly focused and highly technical rather than a no-holds-barred attack. Theology, philosophy, ethics, psychology, economics, law, and history. There is no single volume that has come out of scientific creationism that summarizes the nature of the war between creationism and evolutionism in the main areas of modern thought. There is not even a path-breaking scholarly monograph in any one of these outside fields. This is not because there are not intellectually competent people within the creation science movement. It is because of the self-imposed methodological armor that scientific creationists have donned. They have worn Saul's armor into battle against Goliath, and it does not fit. It hampers an effective attack on the weak points in the enemy's defenses. I think there are two glaring weaknesses in creation science. 1. Reliance on the traditional apologetic method of empiricism rather than on Cornelius Van Til's biblical presuppositionalism. 2. An excessive reliance on the fall of Adam and the resultant curses of God rather than on the resurrection of Christ and the resultant blessings of God. This second error is reflected in creation science's heavy reliance on the second law of thermodynamics as the basis of its case for creationism. What I argue in this book is that any appeal to the second law of thermodynamics must remain at best essentially a negative critique of one technical aspect of Darwinian evolution. It involves taking a principle of humanistic physics, 19th century physics at that, and arguing that evolutionists have disregarded the importance of this principle. Christians have told the evolutionists that humanistic science has been inconsistent in not acknowledging the overwhelming importance of the second law. Darwinian scientists have universally dismissed this challenge as ill-conceived, erroneous, naive, and inconsistent with, quote, what science really teaches, end quote. See Appendix A. Because Darwinian evolutionists control virtually all the classrooms of the world, and not just the natural science classrooms, they have taken the position that they can safely ignore technical criticisms of their position, since the average student or voter will not grasp the importance of technical criticisms. They correctly understand that whether some technical accusation is accurate or not is politically irrelevant. The heart and soul of modern Darwinism is not scientific, it is political. Humanism's religion is above all a political religion, for they believe in social salvation by legislation. In any case, this tactic of appealing to the second law of thermodynamics is at best negative, showing an inconsistency in the other man's position. It has also created a kind of blindness on the part of the creation science movement. Creation science has been needlessly yet so visibly dependent on this appeal to the second law that its leaders have neglected to discuss what should be an obvious point. The resurrection of Christ has, in principle, altered, redeemed man's relationship with God and nature, and it has therefore altered God's relationship with man and nature, for man is God's covenantal representative over the earth. Genesis 1, 26-28. Science and motivation. You need to keep this question in mind as you read this book. If the world is inevitably running down, what hope can Christians legitimately place in their earthly efforts, scientific and otherwise, to improve life on earth? If Christians have no legitimate biblical or cosmic hope in achieving the gospel's goal of making God-honoring, worldwide improvements in the external condition of this world and history, Deuteronomy 28, 1-14, before Christ returns, physically in judgment, then why should they sacrifice everything they possess to launch a doomed frontal assault against Darwinism? There is only one reason, because they believe that God has told them to do so. But the problem with this fallback motivation is that the vast majority of those who deny that the church can be victorious in history also believe that God's law is no longer binding in New Testament times. Thus, the ethical motivation of obedience is undercut, for Christians do not know specifically what God requires them to do. Thus, they throw away their God-given tool of dominion, His law. They have lost the motivation of victory, optimism, and the method of victory, God's law. They have therefore lost most of their cultural battles, and they have been involved in only a few since 1925, the year of the Scopes' quote-unquote monkey trial. Darwinists obviously control the major institutions of this world, including most of the churches. The readers of this book know this. So do the readers of scientific creationism's books. If the world cannot be comprehensively improved prior to Christ's second coming, then why should Christians risk everything they presently possess in trying to convert, dislodge, and replace the Darwinian princes of this world? Why not just stand on street corners and pass out gospel tracts and wait for the inevitable end? This mental outlook of assured historical defeat creates a major problem for scientific creationism. There is nothing to be gained culturally from tearing down Darwinism, since everything is under the quote-unquote curse of entropy anyway. The battle against evolutionism therefore appears to be an intellectual exercise indulged in by a tiny handful of obscure fundamentalist scientists. If Christians in general are unwilling to risk everything they possess in a broad-based challenge to Darwinian humanism in every area of life, how will scientific creationists ever prove their case to the Darwinists? Not prove it technically in some narrow academic field, which has never been the main issue, but prove it ideologically and psychologically. We are dealing with covenant breakers who worship at the shrine of pragmatic politics. If we tell them that our worldview offers them no hope for the earthly future, how shall we lead them to Christ? Only by asking them to surrender in history for the sake of a promised victory outside of history. We are asking them to join the losing side in history. A few low-level humanist leaders may switch by the grace of God, but most of them will not. Probably none of the top leaders will. Why should they? They believe in history, but not in God. Scientific creationists are asking them to believe in God, but not in history. This has been Rushdoony's assertion for 30 years. Quote, "The humanists believe in history, but not in God. The fundamentalists believe in God, but not in history." End quote. Furthermore, if Christian leaders, scholars, and writers become persuaded that the second law of thermodynamics has doomed this world to historical decline, why will they want to take the lead in proclaiming this inevitable defeat of the church to their present followers? Do creation scientists believe that politicians win votes by announcing in advance to their followers that a political victory will change nothing significant? That defeat is inevitable no matter what the outcome of the election? If creation scientists believe that defeat is inevitable, and I believe that most of them do, they will be unsuccessful leaders in any movement for comprehensive social reform along biblical lines. If a Christian believes that in the long run his earthly efforts are doomed, and if he also believes that the Darwinists will control the seats of power until Jesus comes again, then the smart tactic is to lie low, keep his mouth shut, and do the best he can to preserve the status quo until Jesus comes again and visibly smashes his enemies. Why would Christians risk sacrificing their life's work in order to launch an attack that calls public attention to their own weakness in the face of triumphant Darwinism in their respective fields? And even if they were willing to do so, where will they look to discover specifically what God requires of them in their areas of personal responsibility? Not in the Old Testament, surely. They have been told throughout their lives, quote, "You're under grace, not law," end quote. So they find themselves under humanist civilization, not Christian civilization. Consider the Christian scholar. Careful scholarship takes a lot of work, a lot of money, and a lot of time. Rethinking any area of life in terms of Christian principles is a lifelong task. If Christians are told from the beginning that no matter what they discover in their studies, the world is still going to run down, then very few of them will make the effort. If they think that Jesus is coming again in the next few years, almost no one will make the effort. Who needs footnotes concerning the world on this side of the rapture in a future Jesus-run international bureaucracy? It is not random that there has yet to be written a single book by any scientific creationist in the social sciences or humanities that comprehensively exposes the Darwinian principles that govern his field, and which then offers a comprehensive, specific, detailed, Bible-based alternative to Darwinism. Yet the scientific creation movement is over a quarter century old. Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859. A quarter century later, the whole academic world had been reshaped in terms of his worldview. Darwinism dominated discussions in every academic discipline by 1885, all over the world. Scientific creationism has yet to produce its first scholarly book in any field outside of natural science. This should warn us that there is a fundamental problem with scientific creationism. It is the problem of the resurrection. Scientific creationists ignore it. A paradigm shift is in progress. I do not expect to persuade the founders of the scientific creation movement with the arguments in this book. Very few established scholars ever participate in a paradigm shift. I do expect to persuade the best and the brightest of the younger members of the movement. Like the Darwinists, scientific creationists do not hold their position because of scientific arguments alone, or even primarily. They hold them because of the overall worldview they have already adopted personally. They came to six-day creationism after their conversions to Christ. They did not begin with six-day creationism and then become Christians. On this point, the Darwinists are correct. Scientific creationism exists only to bolster the Christian religion. What they refuse to admit is that Darwinism exists only to bolster the anti-Christian humanist religion. In short, a scientist's worldview generally determines the kind of science he does, not the other way around. The prevailing Christian worldview is now changing. An eschatological shift is in progress in American fundamentalism, from pre-millennialism to post-millennialism. The fundamentalists are beginning to recognize this. The humanists are also beginning to recognize this. An ethical shift is in progress, from antinomianism to theonomy, God's law. An apologetic shift is also taking place, from natural law evidentialism to biblical presuppositionalism. These parallel shifts involve a total restructuring of the prevailing fundamentalist outlook regarding time, ethics, and the impact of Christ's resurrection in history. As more and more Christians adopt one or more of these recently acknowledged, yet original New Testament viewpoints, this will eventually produce a restructuring of the scientific creation movement. This restructuring will begin with a rethinking of the doctrine of Christ's resurrection. Christ's resurrection. Jesus Christ's resurrection in principle redeemed man's ethical relationship to God, thereby overcoming the break in mankind's personal relationship to God that took place when Adam rebelled. Creation scientists understand that Christ's resurrection restored individual men to God, but they have not pursued another crucial implication of this altered ethical relationship, that nature's relationship to man and God has also been altered in principle by the resurrection, just as this relationship was altered by the curse which God placed on the cosmos when Adam rebelled. Creation scientists never discuss Christ's resurrection as the foundation of progressive cosmic restoration. The earth was brought under a curse by God in Genesis 3:17 through 19. This is the key biblical passage in the creation scientists' argument based on the second law of thermodynamics. But what about the resurrection? The resurrection was the great healing event in history. It definitively restored redeemed mankind as the legitimate heir of God. This new ethical and legal relationship is to be worked out progressively in history. Therefore, these questions must be raised. What effects on the cosmos did Christ's resurrection produce? None? If not, then why not? If God's visible curses were placed on the cosmos because of Adam's covenantal rebellion, then why were there no blessings placed on the cosmos as a result of the death and resurrection of his Son, Jesus Christ? Was Adam's rebellion of greater consequence historically and cosmically than the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the Son of God? Why did the covenantal restoration of the resurrection produce no healing cosmic effects? Why is the curse of God in Genesis 3 still in full force in history? The answer is, it isn't. There has been a progressive healing of the earth since Calvary. This has come sporadically in response to the sporadic covenantal faithfulness of God's people. There have been major scientific advances, remarkable medical progress, and economic growth, especially since the Protestant Reformation. Western civilization has brought these wonders to the common man, the first civilization to do so, and Christianity was originally the foundation of the West. Redeemed men have been the primary agents of this healing. It is their responsibility self-consciously to carry out the dominion assignment of Genesis 1:26 through 28, which is why Christ delivered the Great Commission to the church, Matthew 28:18 through 20. The effects of death and decay are progressively rolled back when God's people faithfully transform their lives, institutions, and physical environments to conform to God's revealed laws. Christians need to start arguing that the burdens imposed by the second law of thermodynamics could be progressively removed as a curse on man and the creation if mankind would repent before God. Even better, they should become prophetic. The second law of thermodynamics will be progressively removed as a curse on man and the creation when mankind repents before God. We never hear creation scientists arguing this way. It would destroy their original argument. They assume that the second law is a constant, a uniformitarian constant, in the external world, except when God performs a miracle. This constant never changes, except when God performs a miracle. Indeed, this explicit uniformitarianism is the heart and soul of the scientific creationists' technical criticism of evolutionism. The evolutionists supposedly do not adhere to the second law as a constant, they argue. Creation scientists almost always argue as though the imposition of the second law of thermodynamics were God's irrevocable curse on Adam. They never argue that we can legitimately expect a reduction in these curses as a result of Christ's resurrection, the most astounding miracle in the history of man. They find themselves in the unenviable position of implicitly and sometimes explicitly arguing that the cursed effects of Adam's sin will remain cosmically dominant in history, except possibly during a millennium when Christ and his death-free resurrected saints will rule the earth, despite Christ's bodily resurrection. We must abandon this presupposition. We must begin to work out the implications of Christ's resurrection for every area of life. Jesus offers us redemption, comprehensive redemption. No area of life is exempt from the judgment of God, so no area of life is outside the redemptive work of Christ. Am I arguing that the second law of thermodynamics will be progressively repealed in history as a result of the preaching of the gospel? No, it need not be repealed in history because it was not imposed in history as God's curse. The second law of thermodynamics was operating in the sin-free garden, and it will be operating in eternity too. It is an aspect of the original creation, not a product of the curse. This may sound like a radical idea to creation scientists, but as I show at the end of chapter 6, page 127, Henry Morris himself has obliquely referred to this possibility. What we must say is that God has brought curses on us, death, decay, etc., that did not exist in the garden. God cursed Adam and the earth by altering the effects that the second law of thermodynamics has on man and the cosmos. As with everything else in life, there are now covenantal curses attached to man's environment. God used the second law of thermodynamics as a means of cursing us, just as He used the ground and our own bodies to curse us. The question is, can these curses be reduced as a result of our obedience to God? The biblical answer categorically is yes. Read Deuteronomy 28, 1-14 for proof. God's covenantal judgment is a twofold process, blessings and cursings. The resurrection of Jesus Christ points to the cosmic reality of the potential blessings. Christ's bodily resurrection implies that the cursed aspects of the second law of thermodynamics can be progressively removed in history in response to society's increased covenantal faithfulness. Until Christians begin to take seriously the promise of blessings that the resurrection has validated in history, they will not be able to offer a believable worldview as an alternative to humanism's various visions of long-term despair. What Christians offer today is little more than an other worldview, a call to people to forsake the affairs of this life and to retreat into the supposedly safe womb of the local church, since nothing can be done to heal this world by means of the gospel and through the empowering of Christ's people by the Holy Spirit. The end result of such a retreat can be seen today in the Soviet Union. When the society outside the walls of the church falls to the satanic enemy, there are no more safety zones for Christians to flee to. Faithful members of God's church are sent to concentration camps. The quote-unquote safe womb of the institutional church can be smashed. Greek Christians have known this ever since Constantinople fell to the Turks in 1453. Intellectual retreat is the second step towards surrender. The first step is theological, a denial of the comprehensive transforming power of the gospel. The creation scientists' misuse of the second law of thermodynamics is one aspect of this intellectual retreat from the battlefield of cultural ideas. Who is my target? I want to emphasize from the beginning that my primary target in this book is not the creation science movement. My primary target is Jeremy Rifkin. To strengthen the case against Rifkin, I call into question some misguided and simplistic conclusions that many popularizers of modern humanistic science have proclaimed in the name of science. Conclusions that Rifkin has adopted in order to attack Christian orthodoxy and Western civilization. In attacking the fundamental idea in Rifkin's thesis, that the second law of thermodynamics threatens to engulf and overcome Western civilization, I necessarily must challenge certain aspects of the apologetic methodology of the creation science movement. This methodology rests on an overemphasis on the second law of thermodynamics. To repeat, because the scientific creationists have adopted the second law of thermodynamics as their biggest gun in the war against evolutionists, they have fallen into a trap, using the fall of man and God's subsequent curses as the ordering principle of their scientific theory, rather than using the resurrection of Christ and God's subsequent blessings. This strategy has now backfired outside the realm of physical science, as we shall see. I believe that a case can also be made that it has backfired within the realm of physical science, and I present suggestions along these lines in Appendix A. The key problem is the proper Christian use of humanistic science's hypothetically uniformitarian standards. This strategy has created a Christian mindset that plays into the hands of Rifkin, who also proclaims that he too has adopted the second law of thermodynamics as the ordering principle of his radical social theory. It should also be noted that this strategy has gained very few converts within the ranks of the physical science profession. What I argue throughout this book is that Rifkin's growing popularity among otherwise conservative evangelicals has been aided by the reliance that conservative Christians have placed on quote-unquote entropy as the number one intellectual weapon in their war against the evolutionists. Entropy, modern science informs us, is a measure of disorder, a disorder that does not decrease for the universe as a whole, maybe. When entropy is not actually increasing, the total disorder of the universe remains constant, quote-unquote in equilibrium, maybe. The concept of entropy has an almost hypnotic effect on many Christians who possess only a smattering of scientific knowledge. Rifkin is an accomplished intellectual hypnotist. He has placed entropy at the end of a 12-inch chain, and he swings it back and forth in front of his Christian audience. His words are soothing. You are growing sleepy. You are winding down. Your mind is wearing out. You are steadily losing IQ points. Everything is becoming confused. Now listen carefully as I tell you the scientific secret of the ages. Repeat after me. Entropy. 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 He uses the word as a kind of talisman, a magical device to manipulate his chosen victims. There is an old line, you can't beat something with nothing. The concept of entropy has been misused to create a philosophy of long-run nothingness. Until Christians stop talking about the world's future in terms of quote-unquote sovereign entropy, they will not be able to develop a believable and consistent positive alternative to modern humanism, meaning a positive program which will give people hope for solving this world's problems. As I argue in this book, to appeal to an exclusively otherworldly hope is to abandon hope for this world. It leads to social pessimism. Apostle of a New Age. I am attempting to refute a new heresy, which is in fact a very ancient heresy, the New Age movement. The New Age movement has made important inroads into Christian circles since 1979, and also inroads into the thinking of Christian leaders. One man more than any other is responsible for this successful infiltration, Jeremy Rifkin. What I argue in this book is that some of the key presuppositions of the scientific creation movement serve as the foundations for Rifkin's cosmological, economic, and social analyses. More than this, their shared presuppositions have made it very difficult for six-day creationists and other evangelicals to respond to Rifkin. Yet Christians must respond to Rifkin. First, his general presuppositions are wrong. They are closer to Eastern mysticism than to Western rationalism. Second, his anti-rational arguments are initially disguised, for he appeals to what he and the scientific creationists say is the key fact of Western scientific rationalism, the entropy law, in order to make his case against Western rationalism. Third, he has distorted the history of the West. Fourth, he has denied that economic growth is morally valid or even sustainable long-term. Fifth, he has called Christians to adopt Eastern mysticism in the name of a new Christianity. Sixth, his recommended economic system would lead to the creation of a huge bureaucratic tyranny, yet he argues as if he were calling for a decentralized, minimal state form of government. In short, Jeremy Rifkin is a specialist in deception. He is very clever, and therefore a very dangerous man. He has self-consciously selected his target, Christians, especially the charismatic and the neo-evangelicals. He writes that, quote, "We are in the morning hours of a second Protestant Reformation. It is the evangelical community with its resurgent spiritual vitality that has the momentum, drive, and energy that is required to achieve this radical theological transformation in American society," end quote. He is determined to take advantage of this second Reformation, to redirect it along very different paths from those outlined in the Bible. Overturning capitalism. What kind of transformation is he talking about? Radical. At the very least, it will require a sharp reduction of America's economic wealth. Quote, "As long as we continue to devour the lion's share of the world's resources, squandering the great bulk of them on trivialities while the rest of the world struggles to find its next meal, we have no right to lecture other peoples on how to conduct their economic development." End quote. You know the argument. 1. We eat. 2. They are hungry. 3. Therefore. Then, just to make every successful person feel doubly guilty, quote, "Today, the top 1/5 of the American population consumes over 40% of the nation's income," end quote. Do you know why 1/5 of the population consumes over 40% of the nation's income? Because 1/5 produces over 40% of the nation's income. That fact, I assure you, Jeremy Rifkin and the professional guilt manipulators never ever tell you. I believe that people should not be made to feel guilty just because they are productive. But it is Jeremy Rifkin's self-appointed task to make us feel guilty. Guilt-ridden people are more easily manipulated. Quote, "What do we need?" asks Rifkin. "What tremendous new economic breakthrough is called for?" End quote. Why, that same old utopian dream, that same old poverty-producing scheme, economic planning. The question is, who will be in charge of this planning? If the free market has not promoted such a plan, then we must need, well, he never really says. But bear in mind that if people refuse to do things voluntarily, then someone has to make them do it if they are going to get it done. Quote, "Regardless of which course we follow, the coming transition is sure to be accompanied by suffering and sacrifice." This means America's suffering and sacrifice. But there is really no other choice. We can't fight the inevitable. The fact is, and we can't argue with facts, the suffering will be minimized if the transition from the existing energy base to the new one is made now in a thoughtful, orderly manner, rather than later out of sheer panic and desperation. We are rapidly approaching the absolute limits of the fossil fuel energy requirement. If we wait until we run smack up against the wall of this existing energy base, we will find that we have no energy cushion left to ease the transition process." End quote. Ah yes, the old quote-unquote existing energy base argument. The old quote-unquote we're running low on oil argument. It all sounded so believable in 1980. In the first 3 months of 1986, the cash price of oil fell from $29 a barrel to under $10. Let's see if I understand this. Oil prices have dropped rapidly because we are running out of oil. Back to the drawing board. Oil prices can go up, obviously. Oil is now again in the $20 per barrel range as a result of Saudi Arabia's decision to stop selling all the oil it can produce. Terrorist attacks on the Mideast pipelines, or the expansion of the Iraq-Iran war into the Straits of Hormuz, or a Soviet invasion of the Middle East could push prices even higher. The point is, contrary to Rifkin, there is no evidence that we are running out of energy. We are simply the victims of a government-created oil cartel. Like all cartels, it has shown sporadic signs of falling apart, as members cheat on the previously agreed-to production limits. Hopefully, this will continue. In any case, we should have learned by now that capitalism tends to lower the price of raw materials if the free market is left alone. This is the testimony of 2 centuries of industrial production. The evidence is overwhelming. If we ever do run out of commercially available energy, it will be because we first ran out of freedom. New Age politics. What Rifkin wants is a, quote, New Age politics, end quote. What he wants is regional organic farms. Who will run these small regional enterprises? Why, our old favorites, the workers. Quote, "Firms should be democratically organized as worker-managed companies," end quote. Does this begin to sound familiar? Haven't we seen all this before? Isn't this just warmed-over rhetoric from the 1968 counterculture? Isn't this language left over from some yellowing mimeographed platform statement of some faction of Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, the radical organization that, figuratively speaking, blew itself apart in 1969? There will be no jet planes in the coming utopia. Quote, "A Boeing 747, for instance, simply cannot be manufactured by a small company employing several hundred individuals. Thus, a new ethic will have to be adopted," end quote. No more jet bombers, either. No more missiles, I would imagine, not in quote-unquote Christian America. The trouble is, what if the Soviet Union doesn't go along with Rifkin's New Age politics, but the United States does? What then? Now all this should begin to sound familiar. Will life be prosperous in the New Age, the way it is today for most middle-class Americans? I fear not. Quote, "The entropy economy is one of necessities, not luxuries," end quote. Don't expect much, but expect to be happy. Everyone who lives in a utopia is happy. That is the mark of utopias. You are required by law to be happy. That also is the mark of utopias. Utopia, from the Greek words ou equals no and topos equals place. It is also the mark of communist tyrannies. There will be fewer people around to be happy, however. Quote, "Finally, the low-entropy age we are moving into will require a great reduction in world population," end quote. But who will decide who lives, who doesn't, and who gets born? He refuses to say exactly, no use upsetting the potential victims in advance. But he mentions one possibility, having the government license parenthood. All this is offered in the name of a new improved Christianity by a man who was once the head of something called the People's Bicentennial Commission. Who is Jeremy Rifkin? Jeremy Rifkin is a best-selling co-author. He wrote The Emerging Order, with Ted Howard, published in 1979, Entropy, with Ted Howard, published in 1980, and Who Shall Play God, with Ted Howard, a book critical of genetic engineering, published in 1977, which sold over 250,000 copies. He also wrote The North Shall Rise Again with Randy Barber. Then came Algeny with Nicanor Perlis. Who knows? Someday he may write a best-selling book all by himself. Before he became a best-selling co-author, he was the project director of the People's Bicentennial Commission, which employed both Mr. Howard and Mr. Barber. In his biographical summary that he included in his original proposal for the commission, he listed a B.S. in economics from the Wharton School of Finance and Commerce, 1967, and an M.A. in international affairs from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, 1968. He also served as a VISTA volunteer in East Harlem. With this as his academic background, he now comes before us as the prophet of a new worldview, one that supposedly is based entirely on rigorous physical science. It is a lot easier to make a case for Rifkin as an academically qualified expert in social revolution than as an expert in thermodynamics. Rifkin's strategy of subversion. From the beginning of his public career, Rifkin has worked with a specific strategy of subversion. This strategy involves the presentation of revolutionary goals to conservative Americans by wrapping them in the American flag. In late 1971, Rifkin wrote concerning the need for a People's Bicentennial Commission, quote, "At this critical stage in American history, it makes no sense for the New Left to allow the defenders of the system the advantage of presenting themselves as the true heirs and defenders of the American revolutionary tradition. Instead, the revolutionary heritage must be used as a tactical weapon to isolate the existing institutions and those in power by constantly focusing public attention on their inability to translate our revolutionary dreams into reality." End quote. He was quite explicit concerning the revolutionary tradition he had in mind, communism. Quote, "A genuine understanding of revolutionary ideals is what links Thomas Paine, Sam Adams, and Benjamin Rush, and the American people, with Lenin, Mao, Che, and the struggles of all oppressed people in the world. Not until the masses of Americans begin to re-identify with these principles and develop their own revolutionary struggle will they be able to form a real bond of fraternalism and solidarity with the struggles of all oppressed people." End quote. He wrote this for the bi-monthly newspaper of the New American Movement, November-December 1971. But in his Introduction to America's Birthday, published by Simon & Schuster in 1974, he judiciously dropped the earlier references to Lenin, Mao, and Che Guevara. Quote, "A genuine understanding of American democratic ideals is what links the American people with the struggles of all oppressed people in the world. Indeed, the American Revolution has stood as an example for the revolutions of the Third World. Not until the majority of Americans begin to re-identify with our democratic principles and develop our own revolutionary struggle will we be able to form a real bond of fraternalism and solidarity with the struggles of all oppressed people." End quote. Jeremy Rifkin knew exactly what he was doing. He and John Rawson edited a book, How to Commit Revolution, American Style, in 1973, published by Lyle Stewart. Mr. Rawson wrote on page 149, quote, "In the Caribbean islands, new black liberation movements are popping up all over. In Canada, the Québécois Liberation Front has brought the fires of revolutionary nationalism right up to the U.S. frontier. On the European continent, similar fires are scorching the hides of imperialists. In Asia, the entire continent seethes with the movement. The victory of the first stage of the Chinese Revolution can be said to have struck the sparks that set off the whole worldwide phenomenon of revolutionary nationalism." End quote. What about the United States? On page 157, Rawson informs us that, quote, "The American version of the concept of revolutionary nationalism will be anti-capitalist and socialist in content, and national in form and rhetoric." End quote. Mr. Rifkin's partner specified in the March-April 1971 issue of The New Patriot, his own publication, what his understanding of Marx was. Quote, Marx laid the sturdy foundations for the scientific revolutionary socialist methodology, and for any modern revolutionary to ignore those foundations would be as stupid as for a physicist to ignore the findings of Isaac Newton. But neither can a modern revolutionary limit himself to the findings of Marx. That is why I use the expression scientific revolutionary methodology rather than the expression Marxism. The problem with most of those who call themselves Marxists today is that they accept Marxism as a dogma and not as a scientific tool, a revolutionary methodology which is constantly being refined, added to, improved on the basis of the revolutionary experience of the last century and a quarter." End quote. Co-authors Ted Howard, Randy Barber, and Rifkin were all associated with the People's Bicentennial Commission, which was later renamed the People's Business Commission. As he said to a Washington Star reporter in 1979, quote, "Our job is to develop a politics for the 80s and 90s, end quote. A new, targeted audience, evangelical. This was the original goal of the People's Bicentennial Commission, political change. Rifkin began to target evangelical Christians in the late 1970s with his book, The Emerging Order. This was simply a continuation of the strategy outlined by William Peltz, the Midwest Regional Coordinator of the People's Bicentennial Commission. At a meeting in Ann Arbor, Peltz argued that conservative Christians can be turned into promoters of revolutionary politics if you can show them that the Bible teaches revolution. Interestingly, he cited Leviticus 25, the chapter that contains the Jubilee land laws, which required that the ownership of the land of Israel be returned to the original families every 50 years. This has subsequently become a popular theme of numerous radical Christians, including Ron Sider and Sojourners magazine. It has also become a theme in certain fundamentalist groups. They have not understood that the Jubilee was an aspect of military conquest, an economic incentive to fight that was given to each Hebrew family before Israel invaded Canaan. They also have not recognized that the Jubilee was fulfilled in principle by Jesus, Luke 4, and abolished historically when Israel as a nation ceased to exist. But most of all, they have not bothered to tell their followers that if Leviticus 25 is still morally and legally binding, then lifetime slavery is still morally and legally valid, for it is only in Leviticus 25 that the Hebrews were told that they could buy and enslave foreigners for life, and then enslave their heirs forever. Leviticus 25:44 through 46. It is time to abandon Leviticus 25 as the basis of social reform. The myth of neutrality. This book deals in great detail with the writings of Jeremy Rifkin that are aimed specifically at a Christian audience. But it is not simply to refute Rifkin that I write this book. It is to refute the earthly pessimism that Rifkin's thesis promotes. Unfortunately, Bible-believing Christians have adopted a very similar view of the supposed quote-unquote natural decline of this natural world, and this has led to a similar debilitating outlook, a self-conscious effort on the part of Christians to remove the quote-unquote supernatural from scientific discussion, at least in the quote-unquote preliminary stages of discussion. This approach is based on the disastrous lure of the myth of neutrality. Van Til's warning is ignored. Quote, "If the theistic position be defensible, it is an impossibility for any human being to be neutral. This is quite readily admitted when a centrally religious question is discussed. We need only recall the words of Jesus, 'He that is not against me is for me,' to remind ourselves of this fact. When two nations are at war, no citizens of either of these two nations can be neutral." End quote. This neutrality-based apologetic method assumes, erroneously, that the natural man can be led logically from his initial, agreed-upon belief that it is possible to discuss this world without any reference to God, to a conclusion that the God of the Bible exists and controls everything in the creation, a world in which God must be assumed in the first place in order to make sense of our environment. Such a line of argument assumes initially that the doctrine of creation is intellectually irrelevant to the argument, and then the force of logic supposedly will lead to the conclusion that the doctrine of creation is what the Bible says it is, the starting point of all knowledge. In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, Genesis 1:1. This apologetic approach is based on the assumption that rational men can discuss the first principles of science or any other quote-unquote secular subject on the basis of common ground presuppositions about the true nature of the universe. This, of course, is precisely what covenant-breaking men have always wanted to assume, that they could reach quote-unquote workable truths without any appeal to or judgment by the God of the Bible. This is a false assumption. Christians should not make it when presenting their case for Christianity. If we allow the non-Christian to claim rightfully any theory-interpreted fact in the universe apart from God's sovereign control and interpretation of this fact, then we have thereby granted him the autonomy he demands, and that God denies to any aspect of the creation. Van Til's warning is crucial. Quote, "If the Christian position should prove to be right in the end, then the anti-Christian position was wrong, not only at the end, but already at the beginning. In short, any method, as we pointed out above, that does not maintain that not a single fact can be known, unless it be that God gives that fact meaning, is an anti-Christian method." End quote. Christians have mistakenly argued against Darwinian evolution by appealing to the supposedly common ground phenomenon of entropy. Rifkin's book dovetails too well with this entropy-based approach to refuting Darwinism. He too says that he is against Darwinism. He too bases his system on entropy. By accepting his starting point, scientific creationists are left at his mercy. This is a dangerous place to be. Conclusion. Rifkin's thesis, if believed by Christians, can lead to emotional paralysis. He talks about mobilizing Christians, but anyone who takes his book seriously will be difficult to mobilize because Rifkin's outlook, if we believe what he says about entropy and the universe, leads to pessimism and retreat, not revolution. Defeat has not been the expressed intention of the Six-Day Creation movement, although eschatological pessimism has been common in scientific creationist circles. Pessimism regarding positive social change is where the entropy defense of the creation can lead, and usually does. If God, in His grace, sends us a serious evangelical awakening, transforming the hearts and minds of literally billions of people, we will see a rebuilding of society, a healing of this cursed world on a scale that will dwarf the progress of the last 2,000 years. For those who believe in such a coming revival, this is a time for optimism rather than retreat, a time for economic freedom rather than socialism's bureaucracy, a time for expansion and economic progress rather than a zero-growth economy. If we really believe in a coming worldwide revival, then ours is a time to start believing in a positive, earthly future. It is therefore time to abandon Jeremy Rifkin's worldview. Quote, "The purpose of biblical history is to trace the victory of Jesus Christ. That victory is not merely spiritual, it is also historical. Creation, man, and man's body all move in terms of a glorious destiny for which the whole creation groans and travails as it awaits the fullness of that glorious liberty of the sons of God." Romans 8:18-23. The victory is historical and eschatological, and it is not the rejection of creation, but its fulfillment. This victory was set forth in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who destroyed the power of sin and death and emerged victorious from the grave. As St. Paul emphasized in 1 Corinthians 15, this victory is the victory of all believers. Christ is the first fruit, the beginning, the Alpha and Omega of the life of the saints. Had Christ merely arisen as a spirit from the grave, it would have signified his lordship over the world of spirit, but his surrender of matter and history. But by his physical resurrection, by his rising again in the same body with which he was crucified, he set forth his lordship over creation and over history. The world of history will see Christ's triumph and the triumph of his saints, his church, and his kingdom. History will not end in tribulation and disaster. It will see the triumph of the people of God and the manifestation of Christian order from pole to pole before Christ comes again. The doctrine of resurrection is thus a cornerstone of the biblical dimension of victory. The doctrine of the resurrection, however, does not last long in any church or philosophy which surrenders or compromises the doctrine of creation. Creationism asserts that the world is the creative act of the triune God, who made it wholly good. Sin is a perversion of man and a deformity of creation. The goal of the messianic purpose of history is the restoration of all things, Acts 3:21, their fulfillment in Jesus Christ, first in time and then in eternity. R. J. Rushdoony.